We split this 1% in half. Because we want the 1% least likely outcomes. Alright, if this sample outcome falls in that less likely than 1%, that's when we're going to reject what you're saying is true. Alright, so we're good there? All we need now is our test statistic. Our z-stat. And this is the same as we did before. 1586 minus 1560. Alright, that's how far above the mean our sample is. But is that a big number or a little number? Well, it depends. If it's several standard deviations, it's a huge number. If it's only one standard deviation, it's not such a huge number. So our standard deviation of the sampling distribution and the sample mean was 14.14. Does everyone remember this? The standard deviation, sampling distribution, sample mean is 100 divided by the square root of 50 equals 14.14. Alright, and what did our z-stat come out to?
1.84.
1.84. Fantastic. So, let's see. Our z-stat then came out to right about here. 1.84. Stat. Alright. What then is our decision? Yep, fail to reject. We are not in the rejection region. Alright, there's one little thing we need to go over with two-tailed tests, and that's the p-value. For the p-value, because it's a two-tailed test, we need to find that area under the curve for a z-stat of 1.84, and we need to double it. That's the bottom line. We're going to find the area under the curve for 1.84, and we know that's going to be 3.29. So p-value is 3.29% times 2 equals 6.58%. Okay, I want to throw that out there before I explain it, because I don't want you to lose sight of it's just a simple calculation. Find the area under the curve and double it. The rationale behind that is, before we started this test, we did not know whether or not the sample mean was going to be higher or lower than the null hypothesis. Either one would have been a possible way to disprove the null hypothesis. So we're looking at this. We're looking right at 1560. And we say, well, if the sample mean's a little bit lower, that's fine. A little bit higher, that's fine. But as it gets further and further away, we say the probability of being that far away is getting less and less. But we look at it from both sides because we don't know whether it's going to be positive or negative. And so if we find a sample mean that is this far above, we say, well, what's the probability of being that far away from the true population mean if what the realtor says is true? So we have to double whatever the area under the curve on the sample outcome is.
I think about it as a circle.
Okay,
Okay, check this out. Check this out.
give him a chance.
Let's say that we landed on 1.8. That would be the center of the circle. Then all around it might be the p-value. Just about it like that.
Okay.
Sort of.
Okay. That's fine. So I like, well, it's, the sample mean wasn't 1560.
No.
So what is the chances that it would be that far away from 1560? Well, as we get, think of it like, alright, think of it like, you know, if we just get, say, 5% here, like go 5%. There's like a 10% chance we would be within 5% of the sample mean.
So it could be greater than that, or lower than this, and then less than that, and then but greater than the very bottom part.
Alright. I was already a little confused to start.
I'm so sorry. I mean, the word.
It was mostly my fault, confusing myself.
So it's definitely not 1560. We know that.
Yeah.
So
But
we
it's
need
just,
to count that out.
it's like, what are the chances that it will be further and further? What are the chances it'll be that far away from 1560? We have to account for both possibilities of lower or higher. Two-tailed test, we have to double this.
So the answer is 6.5.
Yes. The p-value for this t-test, or this hypothesis test, 6.58. Yes, sir.
Because this tail is, can't we just do the mirror image of the 1.84 over there, and that's still 3.29 and 3.29 together is 6.58?
Yeah, you could. I don't know. Okay. I'm not, that's fine, that's right, but I'm not sure how that helps us. You could just like remember in your head, two-tailed test double.
Yeah.
And I think the rationale is, what are the chances that it's that far away? And the chances that it's that far, you're just saying, well, that far away is this much. I'm not saying that it's positive or negative, so I need to account for the fact that it could have been negative as well.
Right.
There it is. That's why it's double.
Good. Alright, let's try a sample problem. Let's try number 32 in our textbooks. Alright, so I'll leave this. I'm going to erase this. Start number 32.
You just said it.
Professor, just to clarify, when you were saying that we needed to calculate the area, how did you get to 3.29?
Sure. So if this has a z-score, the middle has a z-score of 0, and then our test statistic had a z-score of 1.84.
Yes.
Alright, so we look on the z-table for 1.84, and we find that the chances of being higher than 1.84, 3.29%.
But I'm looking at 1.84, it's
0.96.
yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's the area below.
Oh, okay. Where's the truck?
Yes. Yeah, the z-table gives you the area below,
Below it, and we're looking for that area.
and in this case, we're looking for the area above it.
Above.
Sometimes we're looking for the area below. In this case, area above.
And 1 minus 167 from 1, from 1, because the whole thing would be 1, right? So you do 1 minus 967 gives you the 3.29.
Mathematics.
Are you working on percentages or decimal? I'm
So
sorry.
1 point, I had the 0.96.
Also, you subtract by 1, so it's decimal.
It's a decimal,
Okay, so will you take your and subtract
The
that?
percentage, because every percentage, which would be 96.71.
okay.
from one. No, but the one minus 96.
Got it.
Get it? That's my answer,
Thank
that is
you.
percentage of this, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Okay, alright, so what's our number, so let's say it's 96.
Points.
Like they put it in a decimal, but it's a percentage.
Are actually
From 100.
She moved it, was subtracted from 100. So let's say, if it's a grade, I got a 90.7, how many points are that away from 100%?
Right.
3.29.
That's the decimal has a number. So you can either subtract that by 1, that would be 100, or you convert it into 100%, subtract 96.71%. Hey, do you like chocolate? Yeah, you like chocolate? 32.
What's that?
I'll have a meeting. Not joining.
975.
I have a meeting.
Nine.
You know, she gave me total grade. She said I was nervous, I was in overall, I engaged globally, and I actually just still.
But again, remember I created the house in Tableau. They're gonna count that as high. That's why I'm saying. Is it that? I don't remember.
Remember, I had a big Jessica, because she was using
Remember Tommy had a graph, I had a graph.
Tell me that one slide. Remember?
You can go see it.
They get it 0.9679, and now we have to fix it, so we have to subtract it.
Either way, tell me if it was
You see, I can recall that one grade. I can explain your grade. Yeah, I can tell you that.
Yeah, but you see the stuff that she's bringing up?
Roxanne, do you buy chocolate?
Oh, hot chocolate? Yes.
Stated that way.
I think
That's a man.
I was nervous, she said I was nervous.
where is the presentation?
I also know how to farm cocoa trees and process. Yeah, I know everything, yeah. I did all that. And also coffee. I collected coffee since I was a kid. The flowers are not the same. The global warming is changing, it's affecting the flowers.
So if you're asked the question, what are the chances of a favorable field being?
We do it for our own. The coffee.
Alright, you don't have the double eval.
I'll leave it on.
But if you ask the question, what are the chances of a
I built
favorable field
a
being
graph.
that
I got
far
this
away
one.
from
Farm.
the
We have a lot of lines.
I mean, I got the numbers from my article, but I do it myself, I cited where what are the chances of being 5% away from the bottom of this, I did myself, I created, I didn't get to see it.
Like he maintains himself. Like no
Brand names, I
kid
mean, I
has
don't
ever
know,
seen. He's like,
but I created this, I created that myself, I mean, I got it from my website.
the reason I'm telling you this is because I
Okay.
and
I thought it was free, I was lost.
coffee chocolate like real one.
Go to the presentation.
Well, not everyone. But,
I got it.
Yeah, but how about, well, the one that we make is more pure, it's 100% chocolate. And
Was that
it's so
from you?
pure.
I'm not gonna have
I love it.
Why would I say this?
I talked to people a lot.
heard of what's the Hayden Martin.
I don't know. And then share is right behind you.
This is, you started way back, this, did you start way back this year?
As long as you get it.
So she's saying
Alright, I just had a brilliant thought on how to explain the doubling the p-value. Alright, suppose a Vander Holyfield is in the 98th percentile in terms of height. Alright, so 98% of people are shorter than him, 2% of people are taller than him. So the first question, what are the chances of a Vander Holyfield being that tall? The answer is 2%. Because only 2% of people are taller than him. You with me there?
Yeah.
Alright, so the chances of a Vander Holyfield being that tall, 2%. Alright, next question. What are the chances of a Vander Holyfield being that far away from the average height? Is it 2%?
No,
What is it?
no, it's not. No, from the average height, from the mean.
What is it? What are the chances of a Vander Holyfield being that far away from the average height?
We talking about
48%?
50,
I thought it was 50,
58%? No, wait a minute.
Crash and burn.
Hold on a second.
This is
100%,
brilliant.
100% minus 2 is 98.
No,
Minus 96, I don't know.
it's 4%.
Right, it's 96.
Alright, it's 4%. Alright, the chances of him being that far away from average, 2% here, or he could have been this short. Alright, when he was a baby, alright, the doctor would say, what are the chances of him being this far away from the average height? We don't know if he's going to be really short, we don't know if he's going to be really tall. So there's a 2% chance he could be really short, 2% chance he could be really tall.
But not in the median part.
No, there's a different probability for all that. You know, there's a whole probability for him being in the middle, wherever you want.
So he has to fall within at least 2 standard deviations in order to be considered, no? No.
All I'm trying to say is why do we double the p-value? Why do we double the area under the curve to get the p-value for a two-tailed test? Never mind.
Failed. No, I'm rejecting.
She's rejecting that.
Alright. I'll edit that out of the video. Okay. So in this example, we are given a null hypothesis that the true population mean is equal to 1,000. And we're going to assume that is true unless we have overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And if we do have overwhelming evidence, we'll assume that the mean is not equal to 1,000. What do we mean by overwhelming evidence? Something that is less than 1% likely to happen if this is true. So if this is true, there is a 1% likelihood that this sample outcome happened. If that is the case, we reject. There are going to be 2 ways we can disprove this null hypothesis. Either with a really high sample mean, or with a really low sample mean. Okay, so we're going to have a rejection region up here. And we're going to have a rejection region down here. One second.
The significance level is 0.5.
Alright, sorry about that. So what do we mean by overwhelming evidence to the contrary?
It has to be.
Whatever the level of significance.
Lower than 5%.
Less likely than 5%. Alright, I'm glad this happened. This is a good chance to review. So that's what we mean by overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So these rejection regions are going to contain what percent of the possible outcomes?
0.025.
Yeah, each of them 2.5%, total 5%. Okay, so total 5% of all the possible outcomes, 2.5% in each tail. What is the Z critical value, the cutoff point for each of them?
1.96.
Yeah, that sounds right. What's the one down here though?
Negative 1.9.
Negative 1.96, and Z critical value up here equals positive 1.96. Excellent. All we need now is the test statistic for our sample outcome. We went out, we got some data, 81 points, and we found a sample mean of 975. We happen to know the population standard deviation is 90. So that means the standard error in this case is what? 90 divided by the square root of the sample size. Fantastic. Okay. Our Z stat is going to equal 975 minus 1,000 divided by 10. Okay, so that's negative 25 divided by 10 equals negative 2.5. Fantastic. All right, let's see where that lands on our sampling distribution of sample means. Lands right about here. Z stat equals negative 2.5. What is our decision?
Reject.
Fantastic. We reject the null hypothesis and we will accept the alternative hypothesis. Now just for fun, let's calculate the p-value of this particular sample outcome. Now how do we calculate the p-value?
Look on the C
This
table.
Negative 2.5.
2.5, and they will multiply it by 2, whatever percentages.
Exactly. Exactly. So when we see negative 2.5, what do we? Or just go ahead and tell me the p-value.
0.0062 times 2.
How much? What's the p-value?
0.0124.
0.0124. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So 1.24%. That's the p-value.
Yeah.
That's not what I
Okay.
got.
How did you do that?
How did you get that? 'Cause that's not what I got.
What do you get?
2.5.
I got 0.0054 and then you times it by 2.
So you're looking negative. You're looking on the negative 2.5. Negative 2. No, negative 2.5 even.
It should be
Oh.
0.062.
0.0062. All right.
No, but multiply that by 2.
Yep. So 0.0. Let's do this. 0.0062 times 2 equals that. All right. So this 0.0062. That's the chances of a sample mean being this low. But what are the chances of a sample mean being that far away from the average? You have to double it. If I say, what are the chances of it being this low? You don't have to double it. If I say, what are the chances of it being that far away from the mean? Double it.
The 0.14?
All right, good work. Let me just warm you up for the last little thing before break. The only new thing we're going to do is we're going to say, you know, in these previous examples, someone gave us the true population standard deviation. Right, who's gonna do that for us in the real world? Nobody. Alright, so we're gonna have to make two adjustments. Do you remember what those two adjustments are? One starts with S, the other starts with T. Yep, we're going to calculate our own sample standard deviation, and we're going to use what table? Fantastic. Alright, so we'll just do that after the break. Why don't you take your well-earned break, and we'll come back around 8:13. See you then.
In this class, I take about it. Right up here.
32.
She said everyone.
Depending on-
Right, I think she knows like the topic is what, you know, it's just not really I think that the most analyzed topic on there was what Tom said about the dips, and then kind of like what I thought. That's why I said, oh, you guys are going to work, like, this is all information. You guys but remember, she has
It was based on 5 different people, it was different age, John, you know, but it was, oh, I wrote that in my notes in the bottom.
School goes tomorrow. All right. No, the Board of Ed is closed tomorrow.
What I analyzed.
They must have heard my voice.
But you don't also have to talk for a full 5 minutes, I have to talk for 4 minutes. I got 7 minutes.
No, yeah, right.
The whole group. I got cut off.
Not you.
I also got cut off.
No, no,
my-
listen
my-
to me,
my
okay?
slides.
Listen to me.
When
Oh,
she
yeah, no,
said
Chancellor.
5 minutes, okay, can you just
She
jump
set the
in?
rules over there.
So she could, I got cut off, I didn't even finish all my. No, I did 4 minutes and a half. I got cut off. Why in the bed? It's my bedtime.
Yeah, it's cool. It's still perfect.
Because they never saw the video.
Yeah, man.
Spoke for 4 or 5
I don't
minutes.
understand the most. I did definitely.
Nobody spoke Portuguese. And there was 6
Well,
of us.
that's
Yeah, how do we know that?
There was
You know,
6 of
once
us.
it's like 11.
So when we invited by 6, how much is it?
I didn't go off this for tax stuff.
I got 3.5.
Yeah, it's all chill, man.
Oh my God, if you have 5 minutes, how do you were telling me, I could've.
Yeah, she cut us off.
That doesn't matter, I only want to have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Because she cut us. I don't care, I honestly don't even care about 2 points, 2 points, I honestly did. But she did, she cut us, she cut me off at the 15 mark, right? And I turned to you and I said, this is what she said, you have 5 minutes left, right? I said, okay, no worries, I'm gonna wrap it up, and you jumped in and said, no, I have to go so you start your thing. And then I was like, I'm like, I'm done. No, I was still talking.
You were introducing.
And that's why I said, that's why I told her, I said, I got cut off. I said, I'm never gonna be number 6.
I don't think you got cut off, because
No,
you said what you were
nobody's
saying.
here to
Ask anybody else.
Nobody's here but
You don't
us.
got cut off?
There's only 3 vehicles here.
I said it right in front of everybody. I even said it in front of the whole class.
Well,
The
then,
professor, the one
And then I
that
turned to you, I
goes
said,
after.
Jordan, you have more than enough time, I said, let me just finish.
So there's only 3
No, I
times
have
to
to
be
finish,
here.
jump in.
The first one.
And I said,
There's
fine.
this class, and the one
You
that's
didn't
supposed to go
realize
after.
that?
It's not true, is it?
Security guard. That's the one that has
Oh,
the key.
But the
but
thing
if
is,
the
the
teacher
thing is,
said
that you got 4 or 5 minutes, when nobody else is,
When I walked in, there's
you will not get a full 5 minutes. We didn't get to the conclusion portion of it, because we didn't even get to the conclusion, because.
I don't, but I
we
don't
were
wanna
done for 20
build
minutes.
the test out of it.
I had to
I
go
wanna
on to the
be your-
conclusion slide in order to show it, because we didn't even go over it.
No, I'm human, dude.
There's no way that I got more time than everybody else. I know I was the last person to talk, and whether, so, okay, so then if it was a 20-minute presentation, and you're not the last one, that means somewhere the other people spoke
How's
just as
everything
much,
going?
5
I'm
minutes
just,
or just
I'm
as
just
long.
letting you know that between,
Tomorrow is half an hour long,
Yeah,
so
and
I've
you
got
know,
time
she
to
probably
give
won't.
it like an
she
hour and a
said,
half.
you got 5 minutes.
Oh, you too, you parked out?
And I said,
No.
okay, and I said, I started talking,
No, I,
and you jumped in and said,
I
wait,
parked
wait,
in the
wait,
driveway.
and you started.
but
And I said, can I just
go from
continue?
New
He
Rochelle
said,
to
he said,
Jamaica,
no, and I just
probably have to
started.
give it an hour and a half.
You don't
I'm
remember
just
that?
saying, do you shovel your car?
I remember
you
saying,
gotta-
okay, no, let's just pick it up.
No,
I mean,
because I parked at the edge of the driveway, so
There were 6 of us.
It
I
doesn't
only
want
had
to
3
your
minutes
car.
talking.
it does, but I push it off and I
That's,
just drive
that's
out
why I
rather
said
than
there was
shoveling my
5
way out.
minutes left. She said 5 minutes.
I don't
left.
park all the way
We
at
still
the
have
end of the
time.
driveway, you know
Because
what I mean?
you only
I like
have
to
to
park
speak
at
4
the edge
minutes.
of the driveway.
Okay.
That's what you have to speak.
I don't know how the, how's
Conclusion
the
is not
sun.
the
Tell
conclusion
you
you
don't
have
have
done
to
it, you
shovel
get
that
done.
much.
But if anything, you should have been provided.
I think something very sad. I used to work for a guy,
6 of us. So
He used
4
to have
minutes each person.
a
should-
contract with a company,
I didn't speak for
drive
5
famous
minutes.
people from
I
Telemundo,
didn't
like,
know where I spoke for 5 minutes.
yeah,
I didn't have 5
Latino
minutes.
sort of family insurance, TV channel thing.
If at
Anyway,
the very
hey,
end,
we're
he and I
showing his
were left
house.
with whatever was
And he's
left
like,
in the entire
he was a
presentation,
heavy
and 4 people
guy.
ahead of us.
Little
And I
old.
remember other
I'm not,
people just like,
I'm not.
4 people
I'm
died
just
of a
saying,
heart attack
If
shoveling.
you wanna
That's
ask
one of
anybody,
them.
they'll tell you.
It happened 2 years
They'll tell
ago.
you. They'll tell you.
So,
what, that I took them on Saturday?
yeah,
they-
and I just never
she
thought
said
that
the 5
that could
minute
possibly happen, so just be
I
careful
said,
out
that's
there.
okay, we have time.
I'm used
And-
to
I
shoveling
usually
snow.
just,
No,
They
you
drink
I
some
love
water.
shoveling snow.
jumped in.
Right now I have a driveway,
At that point, she
and
said it was 5 minutes.
my truck is not mine,
You
it's
spoke
twice.
for 5 minutes because we
But the
didn't
price
really
is
do
just,
the conclusion.
chuck
Do
tequila.
you guys remember we didn't do the conclusion? Because Jessica went to talk.
Well, this is my driveway, I
Fireball.
can park like, you know,
She didn't-
4
she didn't
cars
have time to finish the conclusion.
for the whole length of
Because
the
we didn't
driveway.
finish. All
So
I
instead
did
of
was
parking
put it
at
on
the end of
the
that
slide and
driveway
everybody
to,
was,
you know,
it was there for people to see.
the garage, I would park at the
Either
end of the
way-
driveway where,
Sometimes
you
might
know,
not even
it's on the
realize
road.
that.
Either way, at the end
Once I
of
brush it
whatever
off.
But that's
you
what she
had to
said,
say,
that's what she said.
I'll worry about shoveling
I'm
when I get
changing
home.
the groups because it wasn't fair to
Yeah,
everyone.
you understand.
Some people didn't get
I get to
enough
work.
to talk when other people did. And I told her right in front of everybody, I said, yeah, you cut me off.
Well, it's
You got
already-
your 5 minutes.
Reminded us that we're
I told her,
essential.
you cut me off on
Employees,
my
yeah.
5
The
minute
closer
mark
we are
and
to
then
the water and
Joanne jumped in
Yeah.
and I didn't get to finish what I was finishing.
That's not true, but there is a lake effect, but.
In the Bronx,
But
it's
this-
going
remember?
4 inches.
No,
All I
it's this
remember-
time because
Maybe you were just nervous or something. I
the
don't
front
know.
is
That's what-
out in the ocean.
I'm not saying I'm not
I-
taking
I-
it.
I swear to my kids this one.
I'm not saying I'm not capable, it's something I would probably do.
And you can
I'll
try
finish
this,
this.
you know,
It's
you
the
have
unit
to-
is
that is-
Asian.
you can finish.
I don't think
But
it's big.
I'm just being very, very
You did
honest.
not
It's
have
not for
5 minutes, you didn't speak for 5 minutes?
Yeah, definitely.
I spoke for me.
That's something the eye of the storm is out in the ocean.
There's no way, you definitely spoke for
Right.
because Tommy was the one who spoke for
How they measure snow in the
So,
ocean?
some words limit on that. Tommy was spoke for 2.
I mean, it's
Tommy did not.
Hurricane.
So Karen, you definitely spoke more than 3. Okay, we're gonna. I know, whether or not she cut you off.
She cut me off at 5 minute mark.
Okay,
That's
and
what,
then
that's what
you
you're
said
supposed to,
that.
that's 5 minutes.
Right, and then, first of all,
It
that I
does
had
feel
to
like
do all
say
supposed to be
it's
5
saved
minutes.
as you're typing in.
5 minutes divided by 6 is not. 20 divided by 6.
I thought it was like 25 minutes.
It was supposed to,
Does it say
it was supposed
Yeah,
to
but you can't go back, that's what you have to know, you have to finish
Didn't she
it,
say we're
that's right.
25-minute
No.
presentation?
I thought you meant like when you're typing and it says save, does that mean that's it?
Oh, no.
That's what we always said, we have to.
Either way, Tommy
have to-
didn't speak
Yeah.
for 5 minutes.
No, no, I
He didn't speak
did it
for 5
by
minutes,
mistake,
but
like,
Jessica
Fine,
was able to speak
Jessica
for
spoke for a
long
while.
time. Jessica spoke for a long
We
time.
both did.
And Yolissa spoke minimum,
Yeah.
3 minutes. I spoke minimum 3 minutes and you spoke
I'm
5
like,
minutes.
whoops, bigger one.
You
So if
between,
you take 5 minutes for you,
Look
4
at them.
minutes for one, 4 minutes for the other,
Right.
that's 14 minutes.
Everybody
That's 6 minutes.
No, not really, because I'm just a good one.
That's what I'm saying, she said it, she knows it. She knows it. She knows that.
You grab your
That
walking
you
in
have
there,
to
right?
wait for long. And I don't, honestly don't care. But I'm saying that I was also cut off when I was trying to speak. And then I told you, let me finish. You said, no, we gotta wrap it up. And you jumped in.
I am not doing a 1 year.
But I was saying that I was also.
They said they updated it.
When you went to give your dinner for us, was because you didn't have no time to
Oh, yeah.
I didn't have time, so when I got to this part.
Two last semester, this semester I've only taken 1.
No, it's not too bad, but
I
you have
think
to
your
work
last
next
slide, when
year.
you're talking about the,
No,
you did not.
I'm
Yeah, I
not
think
lying.
3 years.
I was just.
I know, I got cut off for.
You had time to speak about whatever it was I had with the graph. Your slide where you were introducing me was where you got cut off. That's why I said you just flip the page, just like I got it, because that was your time to introduce. Remember you said, I'm gonna just introduce. At that point, I was like, wait, I didn't want to take out. Do you understand? Like your presentation.
Are you speaking for me now too? But I needed to say, if I told you and I told you, let me finish, you turn to me and tell me, no, I'll wrap it up, then did I finish or did I not? I did say that because everybody looked at you like, they were like, what? Did she just do that? Like, and I said, no problem, go ahead. And then I told the professor,
I can wait. Well, I was reading one right behind you.
we have 6 people.
You have to take another semester.
That's why I said, when I told you, I said 5 minutes over, you have enough time. And you said, no, I'm not giving up now. And you jumped
Yeah,
in.
like, oh, something. I'm not worried about that. That's, yeah.
No, we have 5 minutes.
I can wait. There's only another couple of months.
You know, I was
We got it done.
Jessica. Melissa went in and out.
But I will not take that phone class. I have to definitely take it. Again, I don't want to be.
And that's why I said, when she said 5 minutes, I said, no problem, we still have time. Because that gave me an extra half a minute or you know, to finish it, and you have 4 minutes. And then that's when you turned around and said, no, I have enough time. You know, she was throwing, she was giving us 5 minutes. That's what we were doing, so it's like, no worries. Because you weren't supposed to go for 5 minutes to yourself. So he said, no, let me finish. And then that's when he said, no, I'm wrapping it up.
Oh.
No, Joe, I'm serious, I'm not. No, I said she was giving us a 5 minute mark.
I was like,
People will continue if they didn't let them know that the next person knows that they have, if they have 2 people, someone has to cut off. But I only have 1 person for you, so I said, okay, I still have a minute that I can talk. And that's what I'm not, I'm not gonna do it.
But do you understand why?
Yeah. So we're good. And we were like, sure, and I said, no worries. And I told her, oh yeah, it's nice, I got cut off in my next one.
right, so,
And she's like, I know it. I'm like, people that way, we can divide them. So, look at it right now, it's 20 minutes, we got 5 of us. And we said each person
calling
should have 4 minutes.
and I have a wrong number.
Yeah, I understand.
Anyways,
It happens.
Right away.
Just,
Hey.
yeah.
but I took that as that's how I do it.
You see on her face.
Especially when all these.
I'm like,
really?
No, you got like, you jump in, you were like, oh my God, you patted it, I saw you pat it. And then I told you, but you, then I turned to you and I told you, we have time, and you said, no, I'll wrap it up. And you jumped in, and you cut me off. Fine.
she said,
Because I wasn't gonna argue with you in front of the whole classroom.
Look at from
I think everyone's leaving and they turn off.
So we had, she said 5 minutes, we already knew that we could.
This building is unstable.
they called her.
Everyone turn on your computer so it'll heat up.
And then there's 6 of us, so you have to divide that by.
And I told her, I said, you said I gotta work on it.
3 of us were independent, you know, but when I saw that, I saw that
Yeah.
you had 5 minutes, 5 minutes, I said, okay.
No, one class,
Finish it out then.
I never know.
teach you less skills in
I'm
emergency.
gonna go
Because
into
that
public
makes
service
sense.
that go into
Yeah,
your
but
Oh, it's like,
topic.
you said we're not gonna have different unless the one.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that?
Right, I did that, then I did the traffic sequence, and then I jumped into the other graph, and I was talking about the difference between the people that are closing, why they closing.
The original message was free. And she did bring the rest of it. She made a copy, left one with Ada, gave
Say what?
she brought it to my attention, and she gave me that. So she did. I knew about it, I knew that it was a switch of babysitter. Jennifer McLean is
Not even one to
It's
take.
like the difference of the left, especially with these case studies.
Have you tried?
No, that's what I did.
Popcorn edges?
I had to sit down.
Yeah.
Something
Something like that, it's like a
We need to
popcorn
get in touch
traction.
with her. Contact
It's
her.
really nice. I
She
think it's
couldn't get
culture.
in touch with her.
Yes, no, maybe.
I was just so upset. I'm like,
Find the job.
right.
Just find a job.
Just
It's not
find
hard.
it.
Just find it.
Right.
And then you have to make the signature.
Yeah, you did it or?
No.
You didn't do it?
No, the instruction is pretty simple.
Count.
It says count if and then parentheses, so,
And then that's it.
yeah.
I mean, that's all it's.
That's all it's like
that's it.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
How boring.
Oh, boy. So you don't mind not being home?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Usually when they, like, storms and something, it's like, you like something.
It's always deep winter and always the coldest day.
Right, so then you're rushing to the store.
I read this, not mind you. Mind you. There's only 8 of us on our team. We are around the round table. So I can't see my phone now. As the superintendent is talking. So I felt the vibe and I just looked down. I saw it was from you. And I was able to open up the phone. Mind you, she's sitting directly into me. And when I read,
Because we called it, didn't we call it? Didn't we call it? Like, they just gave it to you. Like, you could see it on the face and how she was in front of them. Like, she tried
and I'm just like, what, did she ever take ownership that it was her fault? No? Oh, more so now than you.
All right. Before we start, I actually wanted to make a quick announcement. I don't know if any of you have worked on Strategic Consulting Institute projects yet, but I have a project that I'm looking at with a business that runs a parking app. Like in New York City, if you want a place to park, then you log onto their app. And they want a Strategic Consulting Institute project. And we've known them for a while. They came to the board meeting, I think, a few months ago. Dr. Manganelli liked them a lot. And they want a number of interesting things. They want some financial analysis, basically how much they're worth if a venture capital company was going to buy them. So there's some financial valuation for that. And also just the alternative financial valuation, like if you can't evaluate based on cash flows, you evaluate based on like clicks and other things like that. So there's a valuation component. There's also a marketing component. They want to know how they could market and better grow, so we might put together a business plan for them. And the third thing they want is an outline for data analytics. Like what sort of analytics should they keep track of for these parking metrics? What would be useful to the garages that are their customers and the parkers, the drivers that are their customers? So that's the project. If anyone is interested in working on that with me, please email me, call me, or see me afterwards. Any questions?
But it's something that's gonna require full time.
When does the strategic stuff usually happen?
Usually it happens around now. Last year, Dr. Manganelli sent out an email and said, if you're interested in a project, email me back and I'll kind of sort you out. But that just hasn't happened quite yet this year.
No, so I mean in terms of time frame, like if you work full time, are you still able to assist with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not full-time. There's no full-time requirement. For my projects, I like to have a weekly conference call, probably in the evening, because that's the only time everyone will be able to do it. And we'll have a weekly list of to-do items. We try to stay focused. These things, often students are really excited about them in the beginning, and we get a lot of people saying they want to do them. But as you have other demands and your teammates don't do their part, it just kind of gets tedious and gets confusing. You don't really see any progress. And I worked on a project like this when I was in business school. It's just the kind of thing that is always last priority for everyone. So when I run these projects, I try to just keep us all focused and do a weekly conference call with to-do action items. And a good thing about this project that I'm excited about is that they already have a very specific thing that they want. They want those three things: finance analysis, marketing analysis, and just an exploration of data analytics. And the data analytics part too, it took me a while to figure out exactly what they were asking for. I thought they were going to give us data and say, crunch it for us. But they're really not to that point. They just say, tell us what to do. Just do an analysis of what we could do for data analytics. So it's more just a practical, what would you do if you could get any data you wanted? What sort of data would you look for, and what would be the most valuable, and how would you use it? So, not a whole lot of crunching numbers, just a lot of talking about the theory with that.
But would it require coming to campus for like to meet?
No, it wouldn't. There would be a final presentation where you would come to campus, and they're close to Manhattan, they're near Grand Central. There might be one time where we would want to meet in their office or meet in campus just at the beginning to ask them some questions. So be coming to campus 2 times. Yes, Scott?
I'm interested.
Okay, great, yeah. See me after, email me, call me.
Okay.
Okay. Plenty of room. It's not.
You call me, Chris?
Yeah, I'll send you an email.
Oh, great, fantastic. All right, so back to hypothesis testing. So, this last example, 9.7, this is the same situation with the realtor. The realtor says, come to St. Louis, I'll hook you up, I know people, the rents are great. In fact, the average rent is less than $1,560. And you get that same sort of creepy feeling, I don't really believe you. But I tell you what, I'm going to approach this scientifically. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to call your claim the null hypothesis. You say the mean is less than or equal to 1560. All right, I'm going to believe that unless I have overwhelming evidence to the contrary. If I have overwhelming evidence to the contrary, I'm going to reject this and assume the alternative. The alternative is just the opposite. The mean is greater than 1560. What do I mean by overwhelming evidence? That's my significance level. Personal preference. You can decide 10%, 5%, 1%, whatever you want, based on the importance, based on the consequence of rejecting the null hypothesis. You'll consider all those factors. In this case, significance level is 1%. That's what we mean by overwhelming evidence. Anything less likely to happen than 1%. Okay. Now, in this case, we are not given the population standard deviation. And the numbers in this 9.7, they're just a little bit different. They don't have to be, but they are. So I believe the sample mean is 1598. All right. We take a sample of 20 points of data, 20 apartments. All right. And since we're not given a population standard deviation, we have to calculate it ourselves. We calculate the sample standard deviation of 110. All right. Now you just put all those numbers in Excel and you make sure you use the right formula that says sample standard deviation. But if you had to do it by hand, you would divide by the n-1, and it would be a little bit bigger than otherwise would be if it were the population standard deviation numbers. Right? Process then is the same thing. We're going to put this all on the sampling distribution of the sample mean. Okay, let's believe what the realtor says is true, and that the true population mean is 1560. Okay. Now, let's set up our critical value, our rejection region. So our sample outcome, anything less than 1560 and what the realtor said is confirmed. Anything more than 1560, we're suspicious. Much more than we are ready to go on record and say, Mr. Realtor, we don't believe you. You're wrong. You're telling us bad information. And we're going to call that our rejection region. All right. And that is going to contain what percent of the possible outcomes?
1%.
1%.
1% is, we had it, just had it.
Yeah, 1%.
Yeah.
All right, so 1% of the possible outcomes are in this rejection region. So what I need now, 1%. I need now a critical value. And we can't use the Z statistic. We now have to use the T statistic.
Right.
Because the T statistic will compensate for our unknown factors. It's going to make us go a little bit further to ensure that everything within that critical value is 99% of the possible outcomes. So we're going to need to use a T distribution, and we're going to need to use a T distribution with the appropriate number of degrees of freedom. As sample size gets bigger, degrees of freedom gets bigger. So our degrees of freedom in this case is n-1, which is 19. How much area is in the right tail? 1%. Exactly. So you're going to look on the T distribution, 19 degrees of freedom, 1% in the right tail.
2.539.
How much? 2.539?
539.
I like it. 2.539 is the T critical value. Okay, so now we need to calculate our test statistic. And if it's higher than 2.539, greater than 2.539, we're going to reject. If it is less, fail to reject. Let's do it. Or actually, let's do the standard error first. So on this sampling distribution of the sample mean, our standard deviation of the sampling distribution of the sample mean equals 110 divided by the square root of the sample size, which was 20. And what does that come out to? I like it. 24.59. Fantastic. All right, so now our T statistic, our T stat is going to be 1598 minus 1560. All right, that's how much higher our sample mean is. Is that a big number, small number? Well, it depends how many standard deviations that is. Standard deviations, 24.59. All right, what does that come out to? 1.54. Do we like it? 1.54? I'm going a little fast. I'll slow down for just 1 second here. Alright, we've set up our critical value at 2.539. We've calculated our t statistic at 1.54. Let's mark that on the graph. 1.54. That is our t stat. What is our decision?
Fail to reject.
Fail to reject. Alright, it is not overwhelming evidence. It does not fall in that rejection region. So our decision is fail to reject. Now, we could calculate a p-value, but that's just a little hard when we're using the t statistic because we don't have an extensive graph or extensive table. But let me ask you this. If we were to calculate a p-value, would it be more or less than 1%?
It'd be more than.
It would be more than 1%. Looks like a bit more than 1%. It might be like 7% or 8%, something like that. So here there's an 8% chance that the realtor is telling the truth. And the realtor could say, that's kind of like 1 in 10, right? You know, it's my unlucky day. 1 in 10, you know? It's no big deal. Doesn't mean I'm lying to you. Okay. Any questions at all?
I thought it'd be harder, honestly.
Good. Yeah, say that to the camera. Thought it'd be hard. Right. So we're going to go through some slides now, but it's all review for you at this point. You can just sit back and enjoy the slides. There is one little term, type 1 errors and type 2 errors. It's not going to be unfamiliar because we've already talked about this type of thing, but that's the only remotely new thing on the slides. It's like right in the middle.
All I do is I just square root that number first, and then I take that number and divide it by. It's just a different way of doing it.
All right, we ready to do the slides? There's more questions about anything before we dive in?
No.
Okay, the nature of hypothesis testing, that's just how we set it up. Forms, one-tail, two-tail, developing our one-tail test, those details. The possibility of error, that's the one thing we haven't really defined. Type 1 errors and type 2 errors, we'll just go over that. How we set up two-tailed tests, and of course we ended with this using the t-distribution, because in the real world we're not given certain things, so we use the t-distribution. Alright, so in hypothesis testing we make a statement, let's call it a hypothesis. Alright, and then a sample is taken in an effort to establish whether or not that statement is true. If the sample produces results that would be highly unlikely under the assumption that the statement is true, we conclude that the statement is false. We set this up with a null hypothesis denoted this way, and an alternative hypothesis denoted that way. Sometimes you'll refer to people call the null hypothesis the status quo hypothesis.